55,629. That is the number of human beings who, as of the middle of this year, call Greenland home. Not 55,000 as a rough estimate rounded up for a headline. That is the actual mid-year population count for 2026, according to United Nations demographic data. To put that number in perspective, more people live in a single large American high school district, or in one mid-sized football stadium on a Saturday afternoon, than live across the entire landmass of the world's biggest island. And that landmass is not small. Greenland spans roughly 2.16 million square kilometers if you count its surrounding waters and coastal territory, and its land area alone is about 410,000 square kilometers, which makes it more than 3 times the size of Texas. Do the math, and you get a population density that rounds down to 0 people per square kilometer. Not low, 0. There's no other territory on Earth quite like it, a place so enormous and so empty at the same time. So the question almost asks itself, why would 55,000 people choose to stay, generation after generation, on a landmass that is 80% buried under a permanent ice sheet, up to 3 kilometers thick in places, where the sun disappears for months at a time in the north, where a carton of milk can cost triple what it costs in Copenhagen, and where the nearest large hospital might be a plane ride away rather than a car ride? The answer is not simple, and it is not one story. It is a layered history of survival, stubbornness, identity politics, and a very particular kind of love for a very particular kind of land. To understand it, you have to go back almost exactly 1,000 years to a man with a bad temper and a talent for marketing. Around the year 985, a Norwegian exile named Erik Thorvaldsen, better known to history as Erik the Red, sailed west from Iceland in search of a land he had heard rumors about. Erik was not a stranger to being kicked out of places. He had already been banished from Norway alongside his father over a killing, and then banished again from Iceland after a separate deadly feud. Exile seemed to follow him, so when he finally reached the southwestern coast of this new, icebound island, he apparently decided that this time he needed people to actually want to follow him there. The land he found was rocky, cold, and fringed with glaciers, but its southern fjords did turn a brief shade of green during the short summer months, fed by grazing land and marine life. Erik looked at that thin strip of greenery and, in what historians now half-jokingly call one of the earliest recorded acts of real estate marketing, decided to name the entire island Greenland. Not Iceland, which was actually far greener. Greenland. The pitch worked. He sailed back to Iceland, gathered up 25 ships loaded with settlers, livestock, and supplies, and led them back across the sea. Only 14 of those ships made it. The rest turned back or were lost. But those who arrived built 2 settlements, an eastern one near modern-day Qaqortoq, and a western one near what is now the capital, Nuuk. And for a while, it worked. The Norse Greenlanders farmed, raised livestock, traded walrus ivory and narwhal tusks with Europe, and even built churches. Erik's own son, Leif Erikson, used Greenland as his launching point for the first recorded European landing in North America, centuries before Columbus. But long before Erik ever set foot on that coastline, Greenland already had people. Human settlement there stretches back roughly 4,500 years, waves of Paleo-Inuit peoples migrating across from what is now Arctic Canada. Cultures rose and faded over the centuries, the Sakak, the Dorset, and eventually the Thule culture, the direct ancestors of today's Greenlandic Inuit, who were expanding across the island's coastlines, at roughly the same time the Norse were arriving from the other direction. The historical record of what happened when these 2 very different groups encountered one another is thin and mostly written from the Norse perspective, centuries after the fact. So much of it remains genuinely uncertain. What we do know is that the Norse settlements, after enduring for nearly 500 years, a remarkable run by any colonial standard, eventually vanished sometime in the 15th century. Historians point to a combination of causes. The climate cooled sharply during a period known as the Little Ice Age, making Norse-style farming increasingly unsustainable. European trade routes shifted, cutting off contact and supplies, and there may have been growing conflict or at least competition for resources with the expanding Inuit population, whose hunting-based way of life was simply far better adapted to a cooling Arctic than European livestock farming ever could be. The Norse disappeared. The Inuit did not. Their descendants are the ancestors of the majority of Greenlanders alive today, and that single historical fact matters enormously when you ask why people still live there. This was never simply about Europeans stubbornly refusing to leave a hostile island. It is about an indigenous people whose entire culture, language, food systems, and identity were built over thousands of years specifically for this environment. Leaving was never really the framework. Adapting was. There is also a more recent chapter of outside control worth understanding because it shapes present-day Greenlandic politics just as much as anything from the Viking Age. Denmark formally established colonial rule over Greenland in 1721, when a Norwegian-Danish missionary named Hans Egede arrived intending to find descendants of those long-vanished Norse settlers and convert them to Protestant Christianity. He found no Norse survivors, but he stayed anyway, and Danish colonial administration over Greenland's Inuit population expanded steadily from that point onward for more than 2 centuries. For much of that period, trade with the outside world was tightly restricted, funneled almost entirely through a Danish state monopoly, and Greenlandic society was managed with the kind of paternalistic control common to European colonial administrations of the era. Everything changed practically overnight during the Second World War, when Nazi-occupied Denmark lost the ability to communicate with or supply its Arctic territory, and the United States stepped in to help defend and provision Greenland instead, building airfields and weather stations that gave Washington its first real strategic foothold on the island, a foothold that, as we will get to shortly, never really went away. After the war, Denmark formally ended Greenland's colonial status in 1953, folding it into the Danish constitution as an equal county rather than a colony, and international pressure, partly from the United Nations, pushed Copenhagen toward modernizing the territory rapidly, sometimes too rapidly, relocating entire hunting communities into planned towns in ways that, decades later, many Greenlanders view as having done lasting damage to traditional ways of life. Home rule arrived in 1979, giving Greenland its own parliament and control over most domestic affairs for the first time, and that arrangement deepened further with the 2009 Self-Government Act already mentioned. So when you hear Greenlandic officials today talk about wanting full independence, they are not describing an abstract political preference. They are describing the next logical step in a process of gradually reclaiming self-rule that has been unfolding, deliberately and incrementally, for more than 70 years. Let's talk about exactly what that environment demands, because it is worth sitting with the scale of it. Roughly 81% of Greenland's landmass is covered by a permanent ice sheet, the second largest body of ice on the planet after Antarctica. In places, that ice is nearly 3 kilometers thick, meaning it has been accumulating, layer upon layer, for hundreds of thousands of years. Almost all human settlement in Greenland, therefore, happens on the exposed coastal fringe, a thin ribbon of rock and tundra squeezed between the ice sheet and the sea. There are no roads connecting Greenland's towns to one another. None. If you want to travel from one town to the next, in most cases, your options are boat, small aircraft, helicopter, or in winter, dog sled or snowmobile. The Danish colonial administrators who once ran the territory simply never built an inland road network because the geography makes it almost absurd to try. You would be constructing highways across glaciers, through fjords and over mountains, connecting towns that might have a few hundred or a few thousand residents each. It was never remotely economical, and it still isn't. This is part of why over 90% of Greenland's population is classified as urban, even though urban in this context can mean a town of 2,000 or 3,000 people. Concentrating in coastal settlements is not a lifestyle preference. It is closer to a geographic requirement. Consider Nuuk itself, the capital, home to roughly a third of the entire territory's population, which makes it, by a wide margin, the smallest national capital city on Earth. Walk through Nuuk, and you will find a genuinely modern small city, government buildings, a university, cafes, apartment blocks, and a harbor busy with fishing vessels, all wrapped around a fjord system carved by glaciers over tens of thousands of years. Fly north, or east from there, though, and the picture changes fast. Settlements like Itakortormiit on the remote east coast, or Qaanaaq in the far north, might have only a few hundred residents each, no paved streets to speak of, and a rhythm of life still built substantially around hunting, fishing, and dog sledding. Sled dogs remain such a defining part of life in parts of northern and eastern Greenland that regulations actually restrict ownership of traditional Greenland sled dogs to those regions specifically, in order to preserve the breed's genetic purity and its working role, rather than letting it become primarily a pet elsewhere on the island. Language reinforces this same sense of layered identity. The official language is Kalaallisut, a Greenlandic Inuit language completely unrelated to Danish, spoken by the vast majority of the population, while Danish and increasingly English are also widely used, particularly in Nuuk, government, and international business. Food culture, too, remains distinctly its own. Traditional diets built around seal, whale, muskox, and reindeer sit alongside imported supermarket staples that, thanks to the near-total absence of local agriculture, often have to be shipped or flown in at considerable expense, one of the quieter reasons daily life in Greenland can be so much costlier than it looks from the outside. And then there's daylight, or the dramatic lack of it. In the northernmost settlements, the sun does not rise at all for weeks during the depths of winter, a period locals call the polar night, followed months later by a summer stretch when the sun never fully sets, the so-called midnight sun. Winter temperatures in the interior can plunge to negative 40 degrees Celsius or colder, and even coastal towns regularly sit well below freezing for months on end. Sea ice can lock harbors shut, cutting off shipping routes that towns depend on for food and fuel. This is, by almost any conventional measure, one of the most physically demanding places on Earth to build a permanent human settlement. And yet people do not just survive there. Many genuinely thrive there and describe an attachment to the landscape, the silence, the northern lights, and the rhythm of Arctic life that they say they could not replicate anywhere else on the planet. Which brings us to money, because you cannot talk honestly about why people stay in Greenland without talking about how the place actually functions economically. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Greenland is not economically self-sufficient, not by a long shot. Fishing dominates the economy almost completely. Shrimp, halibut, and other cold water species made up more than 90% of Greenland's total exports in recent years, according to United States government trade analysis. It is a staggering level of economic concentration for any modern economy to rest on essentially one industry, and it means that a bad season, a shift in fish stocks, or a drop in global prices for shrimp or halibut can ripple through the entire territory's finances almost overnight. Fishery exports alone generated around 5.3 billion Danish kroner in 2023, according to Statistics Greenland, which sounds substantial until you realize that total government spending that same year came to roughly 9.6 billion kroner, nearly double what the fishing industry brought in through exports. So, where does the rest come from? Denmark. Specifically, an annual block grant from the Danish government that has, for years, covered somewhere between 45 and 50% of Greenland's total treasury revenue, equal to roughly a fifth of the entire territory's gross domestic product. Denmark's central bank has calculated that this grant works out to something like 80,000 Danish kroner per person per year, an extraordinary sum when you consider that is money essentially transferred directly to every single resident's share of the public purse. On top of the block grant, Denmark separately covers Greenland's policing, military defense, courts, and prison system, an additional expense that ran to roughly 204 million euros in 2023 alone. Added up, and public sector jobs, including government-owned enterprises, account for well over half of all employment on the island. 5 of Greenland's largest state-owned companies alone make up 55% of its entire GDP. Now, you might expect that level of financial dependency to breed simple gratitude toward Copenhagen, or maybe quite resentment. But what it has actually produced is something more interesting, a fierce and growing independence movement that exists specifically because Greenlanders want to reduce, not increase, their dependence on Denmark, while still, for now, needing every kroner of that support to keep hospitals open, schools running, and small remote communities connected to the outside world. Opinion polling from early 2025 found that 56% of Greenlanders supported independence from Denmark in principle, but that number dropped once people were asked to weigh it against a real cost. 45% said they would oppose independence if it meant their living standards would actually get worse. That tension, wanting sovereignty but not wanting to sacrifice healthcare and infrastructure to get it, might be the single most honest explanation for Greenland's current political mood. In 2009, Greenland was granted significantly expanded self-governance under a formal self-government act, which handed no control over most domestic policy areas, including natural resource management, fisheries, energy, health, education, and taxation. Denmark retained authority only over foreign affairs, defense, and monetary policy. Greenlandic lawmakers have even drafted a proposed constitution for a fully independent Greenland, though there is currently no fixed timeline for adopting it. Most political parties on the island support eventual independence. They simply disagree, sometimes sharply, over how fast to move and what the economic transition should look like. That debate might have stayed a quiet, mostly internal Arctic political conversation, if not for the fact that in the past year and a half, Greenland has found itself at the center of one of the strangest geopolitical spectacles in recent memory. In January 2026, the President of the United States dramatically escalated a long simmering interest in acquiring Greenland outright, arguing the island was critical to American national security, framing it as essential to systems like the Golden Dome missile defense project, and at one point declining to rule out the use of military force to obtain it. Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, responded publicly and bluntly, telling the American president to abandon what he called his fantasies about annexation, and accusing Washington of behaving in a completely and utterly unacceptable manner. Denmark, for its part, responded not with rhetoric, but with cash and troops, committing an additional £3.2 billion in defense spending specifically earmarked to boost security across the Arctic and North Atlantic region, including Greenland itself, and separately pledging 1.6 billion Danish kroner, roughly $253 million, toward Greenlandic healthcare and infrastructure projects between 2026 and 2029, including a new regional runway and a deepwater port. It was, by any measure, an unusually generous gesture from Copenhagen, seemingly designed to visibly demonstrate to Greenland's 57,000 residents, using the slightly rounder figure often cited in these news reports, that staying connected to Denmark still had tangible material benefits worth protecting. And here's the part that genuinely surprised a lot of observers. Back in the United States, the acquisition push turned out to be remarkably unpopular, even among the president's own political base. A Reuters Ipsos poll conducted in mid-January 2026 found that only 17% of Americans approved of the effort to acquire Greenland, while 47% disapproved outright. When the question shifted specifically to using military force to take the island, opposition became almost universal, with 71% of all adults, including 60% of Republicans, calling it a bad idea. A separate Quinnipiac University poll put opposition to military action even higher, at 86% of voters nationwide, a figure that included 68% of Republicans, an extraordinary level of cross-partisan agreement on almost any policy question in modern American politics. Pew Research Center's late January survey found that 58% of American adults opposed a takeover altogether, with only 21% in favor, and even among Republicans specifically, opposition had actually ticked upward over the preceding year. Beyond fish and geopolitics, Greenland's leaders have spent the past decade trying to build a third leg for the economy to stand on, tourism, and the numbers suggest it is slowly working. Visitors drawn by the Ilulissat Ice Fjord, a UNESCO World Heritage Site where enormous chunks of the ice sheet calve off into the sea as some of the largest icebergs on the planet, along with a growing appetite worldwide for aurora borealis viewing, glacier hiking, and dog sled expeditions, have pushed annual visitor numbers upward year after year, helped considerably by a new international airport that opened in Nuuk to allow direct long-haul flights from Europe and North America for the first time. It remains a small slice of the overall economy compared to fishing, but officials see it as one of the few realistic paths toward genuinely diversifying revenue away from a single export commodity. Mining and mineral extraction represent the other major hope, and the biggest source of foreign interest. Greenland is believed to sit on substantial deposits of rare earth elements, uranium, and other minerals, increasingly critical to batteries, electronics, and defense manufacturing, resources that have drawn exploratory interest from mining companies, and quiet strategic attention from governments in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels alike, all of whom recognize that whoever gains reliable access to those deposits gains a meaningful edge in the global race for supply chains outside Chinese control. So far, actual large-scale extraction has moved slowly, held back by the same brutal logistics that shape everything else in Greenland: no roads, extreme weather, and enormous distances between potential mine sites, and any port capable of shipping the output to market. But the potential remains one of the most closely watched variables in any conversation about Greenland's long-term economic independence from Denmark. Meanwhile, on the ground in Greenland itself, opinion polling showed something even more emphatic. Greenlanders overwhelmingly rejected the idea of becoming part of the United States, in numbers dramatically higher than even the independence movement itself commanded. Protesters gathered outside the American embassy in Copenhagen carrying signs with a message that more or less summarized the entire episode. Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders, not to Denmark by default, and certainly not for sale to Washington. That American military foothold from the Second World War, mentioned a moment ago, deserves a closer look, because it directly explains why Washington's interest in Greenland is not actually new, even if the intensity of the current push is unprecedented. The United States and Denmark signed a formal defense agreement covering Greenland in 1951, in the early tension-filled years of the Cold War, which allowed American forces to establish what eventually became Thule Air Base, now renamed Pituffik Space Base in the island's remote northwest. For more than 70 years, that base has served as a radar and satellite tracking hub, watching for incoming missiles across the shortest polar routes between Russia and North America, and it remains active and operational today, one of the northernmost permanent military installations on the planet. It is worth remembering, too, that the idea of the United States simply buying Greenland is not some novel invention either. President Harry Truman's administration seriously floated a proposal to purchase the island from Denmark back in 1946, offering the Danish government $100 million in gold, an offer Copenhagen politely declined. So the current push, however dramatic its packaging, is really the latest revival of an ambition that has quietly resurfaced in American strategic thinking roughly once a generation, driven by the same underlying logic each time. This island's position on the map matters far more than its tiny population would ever suggest. It's worth pausing here to ask what exactly makes Greenland so strategically valuable that a sitting American president would risk this level of diplomatic and domestic political backlash to pursue it, because the answer says a lot about why the island's tiny population finds itself living at the intersection of enormous global forces. Geographically, Greenland sits almost exactly between North America, Europe, and the Arctic Ocean, making it a critical piece of any missile detection or early warning network aimed at monitoring the Northern Hemisphere, which is precisely why the United States has maintained a military presence at Patuxent Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, in northwest Greenland since the Cold War. Beneath the ice and rock, the island is believed to hold substantial deposits of oil, natural gas, and a range of rare earth minerals that are increasingly critical to modern electronics, batteries, and defense technology, resources that have become geopolitically sensitive as countries scramble to reduce reliance on Chinese mineral supply chains. And as Arctic sea ice continues retreating due to climate change, new shipping lanes are gradually opening across the top of the world, lanes that could eventually reshape global trade routes and put Greenland's coastal waters directly in the middle of a new kind of maritime traffic. In other words, 55,000 people are sitting, almost by geological accident, on top of one of the most strategically significant pieces of real estate on the planet. And that fact alone explains an enormous amount about why outside interest in the island keeps intensifying even as its own population stays remarkably small and stable. Speaking of climate change, it deserves its own honest mention here, because it is reshaping daily life in Greenland in ways that are simultaneously threatening and, in a strange twist, occasionally opening up new opportunities. The Greenland ice sheet has been losing mass for years, a trend that climate scientists have documented consistently, and that loss contributes measurably to global sea level rise, making Greenland's ice sheet one of the most closely monitored geological features on Earth. For hunters and fishers who have organized their entire livelihoods around predictable sea ice patterns, migrating wildlife, and stable weather windows, that warming has introduced real uncertainty and, in some communities, real hardship. Traditional hunting routes that depended on thick, reliable sea ice have become less dependable. At the same time, warmer temperatures have extended growing seasons in the far south, allowed for slightly expanded agriculture in places like the region around Eric the Red's original settlement, and have made mineral extraction and shipping in certain areas logistically easier than it was a generation ago. It is a genuinely double-edged transformation, one that Greenlanders themselves are navigating with a mixture of concern for their homeland's future and pragmatic recognition of new economic doors that a warming Arctic might open. So, circling back to the original question, why do 55,000 people choose this? Part of the answer, as we've covered, is that for the majority indigenous Kalaallit population, this was never really a choice made from a list of comfortable alternatives. It is ancestral homeland, inhabited continuously for thousands of years, shaped into a culture, a language, a set of hunting and fishing traditions, and a relationship with ice and sea that simply does not transplant easily to Copenhagen or anywhere else. Greenlandic identity is not incidental to the landscape. It was built by the landscape over an extraordinarily long period of adaptation that predates most nation-states currently in existence. But there's also something less ancestral and more immediate at play. A genuine, frequently expressed love for the place itself among people who could, technically, given Danish citizenship rights, relocate to milder and more convenient parts of the Kingdom of Denmark whenever they wanted. Many simply don't want to. Visitors and residents alike consistently describe an attachment to the silence of the fjords, the drama of the northern lights spilling green and violet across a winter sky, the tight-knit closeness of towns where, in a settlement of a few hundred people, everyone genuinely knows everyone, and a pace of life that feels, to those who value it, more honest and less frantic than what dense urban living elsewhere offers. There's also straightforward economic logic for some residents. Public sector jobs are relatively plentiful thanks to Danish subsidization, wages in certain sectors are respectable by regional standards, and Greenland's GDP per capita, when calculated against its small population, actually comes out to a genuinely high figure, technically surpassing Denmark's own per capita output, even though that statistic reflects economic concentration rather than broad-based prosperity spread evenly across every household. It also helps to understand who exactly makes up that population of 55,000. The overwhelming majority, generally cited at somewhere around 85 to 90%, identify as Greenlandic Inuit or Kalaallit, tracing their ancestry back through those Thule migrations that predate the Norse by centuries. The remainder is largely of Danish descent, along with smaller numbers of other Nordic and European residents, many of whom work in government administration, healthcare, education, or the fishing industry, and who often describe developing a genuine long-term attachment to the island, rather than treating a posting there as a temporary assignment. The median age across the population sits at roughly 35 and a half years, and the population as a whole skews increasingly urban, with the vast majority now concentrated in a handful of larger coastal towns rather than the smaller hunting settlements that defined Greenlandic life a century ago. That demographic shift, from scattered subsistence hunting camps toward centralized towns with schools, clinics, and grocery stores, represents one of the fastest social transformations any Arctic indigenous population has undergone anywhere in the world, compressed into really just 2 or 3 generations. None of this is meant to romanticize away the very real challenges. Greenland faces serious structural issues that come with being a small, remote, aging population balanced on a narrow economic base. The workforce is shrinking as younger residents sometimes migrate toward Denmark for education or broader opportunities. And net migration out of Greenland has been negative in multiple recent years. An economy built overwhelmingly around a single export commodity leaves little room for error when fish stocks or prices fluctuate. Housing, healthcare access, and cost of living in remote settlements present genuine daily difficulties that outsiders romanticizing Arctic life from a distance rarely fully appreciate. And now, on top of all of that, add the disorienting experience of watching your homeland become a subject of international headlines, debated by foreign presidents and prime ministers who, by and large, have never set foot there, discussing your territory's future as though it were a piece of undeveloped land rather than the home of tens of thousands of people with their own government, their own elected leaders, and their own increasingly clear voice on the matter. And that voice, in the end, is probably the most important piece of this entire story. Because whatever combination of ancestral belonging, personal preference, economic pragmatism, and sheer stubborn attachment to a difficult landscape keeps 55,000 people rooted to this island, one thing has become unmistakably clear over the past year of intense global attention. Greenlanders themselves are not confused about who gets to decide Greenland's future, not Washington, not ultimately even Copenhagen, which Greenland's own government has been steadily, deliberately working to become less dependent on for decades now. The people who actually live on this frozen rock, spread across a coastline thousands of kilometers long, in towns you could count the entire population of using a modest-sized concert venue, have made their position about as clear as a population that small realistically can on the world stage. This is not empty land waiting to be claimed. It is not a strategic asset waiting to change hands. It is home, built by thousands of years of indigenous adaptation, reinforced by a Norse chapter that came, endured for centuries, and ultimately vanished while the original inhabitants remained and sustained today by a careful, sometimes uneasy balance between cultural identity, economic necessity, and an increasingly assertive push toward genuine self-determination. 55,000 people did not stumble onto this island by accident and simply forget to leave. They are the descendants of people who adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth well enough to make it unmistakably theirs. And everything happening around them right now, from melting ice sheets to competing superpower ambitions, is ultimately just the latest chapter in a very long story about exactly how far human beings will go to hold onto a place they call home.